For decades, MGNREGA has been a household name in rural India. It's one of the biggest social safety nets on the planet, a legal promise of 100 days of work. But what if I told you the government is planning to replace it? Completely. We're about to dive into its proposed replacement and figure out what this massive shift could mean for millions.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the fundamental shift happening here. Then, the promise of more work and who's going to pay for it. We'll cover how central plans might affect local villages, the new role of technology, what happens to the social safety net, and finally, we'll lay out the two very different stories being told about this change. All right, let's get one thing straight right from the start. This isn't just a simple update or a few tweaks. The government's new Biometrics bill is designed to be a total replacement of the law we have now.
We're talking about a move away from a system built on the legal right to work to a whole new program managed from the center. Now, the government says this is a necessary reform, a way to fix the problems of the old system. But critics, they see it as taking apart a rights-based framework piece by piece. The stakes here are incredibly high.
So, what's the big promise of this new bill? Well, on the face of it, it sounds pretty good. The headline number is definitely designed to catch your eye.
The new bill would increase the guaranteed days of work from the current 100 days all the way up to 125 days a year for every rural household. That's a solid 25% increase in guaranteed work.
And that right there is the million-dollar question. Because when you start digging into how this is all going to be paid for, you find one of the biggest and most controversial changes in the entire bill. Let's take a look.
Okay, now this chart tells a really important story about shifting responsibility. Under the old MGNREGA system, the central government paid 100% of the wages and 75% of material costs. Pretty straightforward. But the new proposal? It introduces a flat 60-40 split between the center and the states for just about everything. The takeaway here is huge. States will suddenly be on the hook for 40% of the total cost. That's a massive new financial burden, and a lot of people are worried that many states just won't be able to afford it.
And it's not just about who pays, it's also about who gets to decide. And this brings us to another major change, a power shift really, from the ground up to the top down. See, the old system was demand-driven. In simple terms, that means local communities would figure out how much work they needed, and that demand would determine the funding they got from the central government. The new model flips that on its head. It's called normative, which is just a fancy way of saying the center will now use its own set of parameters to decide how much money each state gets, regardless of the actual demand on the ground.
And this is where the risk comes in. The center sets the rules, it gives out a fixed budget, and here's the real kicker. If the actual need for work in a state goes above that centrally approved budget, the state has to cover 100% of that extra cost. This basically puts a cap on the guarantee, and that cap is decided in Delhi, not by the people who actually need the work.
Okay, so beyond money and power, the new bill also brings in a whole suite of new technologies that are set to change how work is managed every single day. The government's argument is that this is all about modernization. It's about tackling those old problems of corruption and inefficiency. So we're talking about things like biometric sign-ins, GPS and mobile monitoring on work sites, using AI to spot fraud, and even high-tech GIS mapping tools to plan projects. The stated goal, more efficiency, more transparency. But here's the trade-off. In the old system, the local village council, the Gram Sabha, was the principal authority. They were the ones who knew the local needs and planned the projects. Under the new system, their role changes. They pretty much become implementers of digital plans designed at the center. So local knowledge is taking a backseat to centralized data.
This centralizing trend has led some critics to call it state-managed labor supply. Now, why that phrase? Well, the bill also bans public works during peak farming seasons. The argument from critics is that this isn't about welfare anymore. It's about pushing laborers who need work to go and take jobs on private farms during those critical times.
This shift towards centralization brings us to another change. It's subtle, but it's incredibly important, and it has everything to do with social inclusion.
Under MGNREG, the Central Council that oversees the whole thing had a legal requirement to include representatives from women and marginalized communities, like scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and others. The new council in the Biometrics bill, it gets rid of those mandatory quotas completely. Critics are pointing to this as a major step backward, a move that could remove the voices of marginalized groups from the highest levels of decision-making.
So, when you put all of these pieces together, the funding, the planning, the technology, the social safeguards, you're left with two completely different competing stories about what this bill is really all about.
On one side, you have the government stance. This is about modernization, it's about offering more workdays, and using technology to cut down on fraud and make the system better. But on the other side, you have the critics, who argue that this bill is actually killing the legal right to work by capping funds. They say it's going to crush states financially, concentrate all the power in Delhi, and weaken crucial social protections.
And that really leaves us with the fundamental question at the heart of this whole debate. Are we watching the necessary modernization of a massive welfare program for the 21st century? Or are we seeing the quiet dismantling of a fundamental right that has been a lifeline for millions of people?